Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. After another bizarre week in American politics, I would encourage you all to check out my last podcast on John F. Kennedy. This week, though, we return to Europe by looking at Austria. In 1986, Austria was due to have a presidential election. In that election, an unassuming bureaucrat called Kurt Waldheim was a frontrunner for the presidency. He had an impressive CV, having served as foreign minister in the 1960s and Secretary General of the UN in the 1970s. However, over the course of the campaign, it was found out that Waldheim, who was 27 at the end of the Second World War, had lied about the extent of his service in the Wehrmacht whilst fighting for the Nazi regime, and had worked as an intelligence officer in Yugoslavia and Greece, two countries whose Jews suffered terribly in the Holocaust. Despite this, Austria elected Waldheim as their president, with his election triggering a period of reflection about Nazism hitherto unseen in Austria. Waldheim's own journey from denial to downplaying to grudging apology about his actions in the Second World War would soon be practiced all across the country. The whole episode demonstrated the differences between how Germany and Austria remembered the crimes of the Nazis, with the Austrians often claiming the status of first victim to German aggression. The Waldheim Affair and its fallout still split opinion in Austria, and listening to my guest's reflections on that period, I was reminded of the weeks after the murder of George Floyd 2 years ago, with Americans and other peoples looking collectively at their nation's histories, with polarising results. That guest is Ruth Wodak, who is an Emeritus Distinguished Professor in Discourse Studies at Lancaster University and Professor in Linguistics at the University of Vienna. Ruth has written many academic papers and a book in German about Waldheim, and her knowledge about the Waldheim Affair shows. When I was contacting Austrian academics about this episode, they all declined in the belief they couldn't do it justice. Every single one of them recommended Ruth instead, and it was great listening to the definitive authority on this very important moment in Austrian history. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Kurt Waldheim. Hi Ruth, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Ruth, we're talking about Kurt Waldheim today. Waldheim was the President of Austria from 1986 until 1992. His career is quite interesting because he became controversial not for something he did when he was president, but because of revelations about his earlier life, about his actions during the Second World War. These allegations became known in 1985 when Waldheim was running for president. Before we talk about the allegations specifically, can you describe in rough terms what Waldheim's public image was in Austria before he ran for president, before these allegations?
Well, he was UN General Secretary, which is a very high position, obviously. And before that, he was Minister for Foreign Affairs and had a very straightforward career as a high-profile diplomat. In that way, he was well known. He obviously belonged to the Conservative Party, and there was some controversy 1968, which I don't know if that's well known, but when the Soviets entered the Czechoslovakia in August 1968 to end the sort of soft transformation which was taking place, many Czech people had to flee and were very frightened, of course, and wanted to flee to Austria. And Waldheim was foreign minister at that time and actually forbid the ambassador, who was located in Prague, to open the gates for these refugees. and the then ambassador in Prague, Kirchschläger, who became Minister of Foreign Affairs later on, and the president also later on, did not obey, which is quite exciting, so to speak, because this is something which happens very rarely, and did give asylum and let people into the embassy, and they were then supported to leave the country. At that point, I think almost 80,000 Czech people left Czechoslovakia and came to Austria. So that was an interesting debate at that time. You know, do you help refugees? Austria is a neutral country since 1955. That was one of the conditions for the Soviets to leave Austria, which was occupied 1945 to 1955 by the Allied forces. And it didn't take well for Waldheim. I mean, the public response was much more on the side of the refugees and on the side of the Czech nation, which tried to resist the Soviet invasion, but that was not possible.
If I can come in there, you said obviously he was a member of the Conservative Party. Other than the story that you've just told about the Czech refugees, why obviously? Was there something particularly indicative about his personality, the way that he spoke? I'm just interested why you chose that word.
Well, his biography shows that he comes from a Christian social background. The now so-called People's Party was called Christian Social Party before 45 or before 38. His father was not a Nazi. His father was actually anti-National Socialist, but they were a part of the Austrian fascist regime, which took place from 1934 to 1938. And in that way, from the family history and from his biography, it was clear that he did endorse such conservative values, very stout Catholic, and he was part of the various student membership, student fraternities, etc., which were on the conservative side, Catholic conservative side.
I think that set up quite well an image of a person who is probably right of centre on political issues and basically a kind of career bureaucrat. Perhaps quite an impressive politician, but probably in many ways quite a dull one, seemingly, in 1985, but accomplished. As I said at the start, Waldheim was contesting the presidential election due to be held in 1986. And in 1985, various revelations about him came out that perhaps punctured that image that he had. Can you summarise what was alleged about Waldheim in 1985 and by whom?
Well, basically, historians started researching sort of in the 1980s because Waldheim published a book about his life, an autobiography, and in this book he described what he did during World War II, which was that he was, like all other young men, Austrian German young men, he had to join the Wehrmacht, the German Wehrmacht, the German army, and he was wounded. That's what he claimed in his autobiography. He was wounded early 1940s, I think 1941, at the Eastern Front. He had to return to Vienna. And then he claims that he actually stayed in Vienna, finished his studies, his PhD, and never left in that way, didn't participate in the war anymore. Now, that was a lie. And that was very quickly discovered and detected that that was not true, that Waldheim had been wounded. That was true, that he went back to Vienna, that he was then recovering there. But then he joined the Wehrmacht again, and he participated in the war on the Balkans, a ferocious, very virulent, terrible war in both Montenegro, in Serbia, and then also in Greece. And various pictures were found of Waldheim, especially also with other officers from the SS, but also one very famous picture with General Löhr, who was the general in Greece and responsible for the deportations of Greek Jews to Auschwitz, and especially from Thessalonica. And what became known later on was that Waldheim had acted or had been a translator of Löhr in Thessalonica, and Waldheim claimed that he hadn't known what had happened there. Now, of course, that raised a huge debate and scandal, because if you translate something, you obviously have to understand what you translate. The deportation of Jews didn't take place far away from where his office was, and he then had to concede, that's already looking forward a bit, kind of week for week, that he had not said everything, or that he had not said the truth, and make concessions. So it was a step by step, always conceding again, because new evidence was brought up, new pictures came out. And he had also claimed that he was never part of the NSDAP, and also not of any of the sub-organizations. That turned out to be not true. He was also part of a student Nazi organization. So bit by bit, during the election campaign specifically, which started on March 3rd, 1986, evidence was provided that he had falsified his past, denied certain actions, and there were then big claims that he had actually possibly participated in the mass murder and extermination.
So if I can just come in there then. So you mentioned that obviously this was a kind of piecemeal process of revelations. It didn't all come out at once. But when the initial photos came out, for instance, photos of him in uniform with some quite senior Nazi officials came out, what was the initial public reaction to that? So was this something that was treated as a great surprise? Because obviously you alluded to this. Most males of a certain generation in Austria had fought for the Nazis in some form or another. So this must have been not considered quite as shocking as perhaps people might think.
Well, the fact that he was part of the Wehrmacht wasn't shocking, because every young man who could fight, who was thought to be able to fight, had to be part of the Wehrmacht. So there were no conscientious objectors, or you couldn't just say, no, you don't want to join the Wehrmacht. It was really one's, as Waldheim frequently said, one's duty. What was shocking was the lying about it. And actually the scandal started on, I remember that very well, I think it was March 3rd or 4th, the weekly magazine Profil published an article by Hubertus Czernin, a very well-known journalist, about Waldheim's time in the Wehrmacht. And they had a photo of his so-called Wehrstammkarte, which showed that he had been part of the Wehrmacht much longer than he had written about in his autobiography. So basically, the scandal was not about, was he part of the Wehrmacht or wasn't he part of the Wehrmacht? The scandal was about he had lied about it. He had lied about his past. He had provided a totally different narrative in this autobiography. And in that way, he had presented himself as somebody very different, as to a candidate for a presidential election than he actually was. And it raised a lot of questions. As you can imagine, one of the questions was, why didn't one know that before? Or as somebody who's elected General Secretary of the United Nations is probably gone through every secret service who is available and who looks at these candidates. So didn't the KGB, the CIA, Mossad, you name it, know about this past? Why was he accepted as a possible candidate?
How do you explain that? Because it's just for people listening. He was supported for this role, the Secretary General of the UN in 1971 by, among others, Marshal Tito, who was the head of Yugoslavia, and obviously in a country where Waldheim had been stationed during the Second World War, and as it turned out, had supported some pretty dreadful things. So how do you explain that?
Well, there is no good explanation up to date. I mean, why? What we do know is that, or what people think they know, is that Tito didn't know about this second participation in World War II. Everybody knew about the Eastern Front and getting wounded, but not about the second part. And Waldheim had even received some kind of medal and decoration from former Yugoslavia. And I'm quite convinced that if Tito, who had been head of the partisans resisting the Nazis and who had fought against Nazism in the Second World War, if he would have known that, there would have been a different kind of resonance. About the other secret services, you don't know what kind of wheeling and dealing goes on, and what happened backstage and front stage. So I don't know about that, and there are well-written historical books about that, but obviously it didn't play an official role when he was elected to be UN General Secretary. And the interesting thing is, again, that the reaction, which you asked me about after the Profil brought this article, was first, actually, people were quite scandalized. But then something interesting happened, and we actually documented this day by day in a book which we wrote about the Waldheim Affair. The New York Times picked this up very quickly. And on March 5, the New York Times brought this piece of document about Waldheim having served in the Balkans and that the autobiography was wrong. And then the Jewish World Congress sort of entered the picture and claimed that Waldheim was a war criminal. Now, there was no evidence for that, and there is no evidence for that Waldheim had actually taken part in any kind of mass murder, extermination, killing of partisans, or similar. So that was not factual. That was alleged. But it led to a huge polarization in Austria, a kind of discussion which in Germany had taken place 1968. Austria had this discussion in 1986 about what did you do during the Second World War.
I want to come on to the sort of the kind of implications of this for the Germans and the Austrians as kind of collective people. If we discuss the election itself, Waldheim obviously won the general election. The presidential election in 1986. How was that victory received? Was it a shock given that all of this had come out? What was the reaction?
The reaction was on the one side, people were very happy that he had won because it was actually thought then as a kind of chauvinistic campaign. We Austrians against the world, we Austrians against all of these people who are alleging that we, the Austrians, are bad people. It was generalized to the Austrians, the nation, and the response was, we Austrians are doing what we want. There were very polemical, very aggressive campaign, interestingly using the color yellow, which was very provocative. If you know that yellow was the color of the yellow star, which Jews had to wear during Nazism. And it had a lot of anti-Semitic, latent and explicit rhetoric, sort of against the world conspiracy, which was now sort of telling Austrians that their presidential candidate was not good enough, and we don't want that to happen. And basically, it wasn't only, of course, not only the Jewish World Congress, whose name unfortunately lends itself to such insinuations. It was the international press. It was the entire international forum who were shocked about all this evidence which became apparent. But the allegations that Waldheim was really involved himself in murder could never be proved. And after the election campaign and after he won, a commission of historians, a committee, was launched with very prominent international historians who basically said, yes, Waldheim had lied about his past. That's obvious. He had been involved, as you had said, with some terrible people, but there was no evidence for him personally to have been involved in war crimes. But of course, he was a bystander, and he also knew about it. Yeah, and that brings up a huge debate, very Austrian and German debate, which was very important after World War II. The scaling of knowledge, who knew what, who participated, who knew what, who just watched, who did nothing against it, or who did resist. Very late on after his presidency, and he once apologized and said he couldn't do anything against it, some apology which many people said it had been his duty to fight in this army. Now, this Pflichterfüllung, as the German term for this, became a very important flag word. There was a lot of debate about Pflichterfüllung, about fulfilling one's duty, because other people, anti-fascists, anti-Nazis, said, how can you fulfill your duty in a murderous army? Yeah, there's no way you have to fulfill your duty there. You cannot fulfill your duty.
I mean, it's a bit of a half apology, really, isn't it? Saying that it
Yes.
was a duty. I do want to ask, though. I mean, I don't. I'm not on board with the idea of it being his duty at all. But there is, at least in the West, it's almost become a cliche now to talk about Nazi soldiers just following orders. It's a very often heard thing. And it doesn't sound great on the ears at first inspection, just following orders. But I think at a deeper level, if you were forced to work and take part in an army as totalitarian and as authoritarian as the Nazi one, there have been endless psychological reports to have shown that most people would not have spoken out against this regime. The reality is the vast majority of citizens in Germany and Austria did not speak out against the regime. If Waldheim had said, rather than it was my duty to do this, but simply I am sorry that this happened, but I didn't do anything because I was too scared for the consequences for me and my family, do you think that people would have been more sympathetic to him in the sort of wider
Certainly.
world?
Yeah, certainly. This is a very kind of justification, legitimation discourse, which we documented and which is very indicative of this Austrian dealing with the past. Sort of denial, sort of first you say you didn't do it, when you then have to admit that there's some proof of evidence or something, then you actually couldn't do anything else, you had to do it. And apologies were quite rare, and reflection was at first very rare. This is what I meant with comparing 1968 with 86 in Austria. Sort of the point, the tipping point, the student movement and the larger movement in Germany were the post-war generation asked their parents, what have you done during the war? Explain why did this happen? And there were big conflicts and rifts going through families, etc. This didn't happen in 68 in Austria. We did have a student movement, but that was about universities, really about more liberal universities and other social movements, but it wasn't about the past. But 86, that was about the past. And finally, the question was asked of parents, grandparents, what happened? Why did you watch? Why didn't you help? Why was that possible? And it might be important to know that the anti-Semitic riots in Austria in 1938, after the so-called Anschluss, were much more brutal than they ever were in Germany. And also the Aryanization of Jewish possessions, forcing Jews to wash the streets, all of that was much more brutal than in Germany. Actually, we know of correspondence and of letters and mails where the German command was asked to stop it, in Austria, because it was so bad. So there was times where, of course, you were in the army and you were forced to do certain things, and very few people had the courage and were brave enough, but actually confronted death immediately if they spoke out. But there were many other activities, denunciations, Aryanization, robbing, deportation, etc., where there were lots of possibilities to help, to speak out, to resist. And we know that resistance in Austria was much smaller than in Germany. And basically the resistance in Austria came from the communists, and the Trotskyists, who then mostly fled to other countries, also to the UK, or who fought in the Allied forces, and from some Catholic religious groups. So there were quite a few priests who resisted, but not from the upper sort of the upper stages or the upper grades of the Catholic Church who supported the Nazis.
There are kind of two elements of this, and I think this story tells you a lot about how the two different countries, how the two different people remembered the war and how they sort of, I suppose, exercised the memory of the war in lots of ways. There's the kind of bottom-up level of the people doing that, but there's also the countries. Can you just go into how the German state approached the issue of Nazism after 1945 versus how the Austrian state did so?
Well, the German state couldn't obviously deny guilt. Yeah? So they had to confront guilt. People were ordered and driven to look at the concentration camps. They were forced to confront the most horrible pictures, documents, etc. And slowly there were trials against war criminals, which specifically took up when there was one very famous judge, Fritz Bauer, who had been in exile and who was Jewish but came back, wasn't liked at all, because everybody who came back was actually reminding the people what they had done and confronting them with it. And Fritz Bauer organized the Auschwitz process, and there for the first time participation not just of individuals but of the whole system was brought to court. That was a very big issue. Basically there were a lot of crimes, were criminals who were taken to court, and also the German state paid reparations to Jewish and other victims. Obviously there were homosexuals, there were people who political prisoners, etc. And in that way, they couldn't deny guilt. Although, of course, there are very many documents showing that there were attempts to deny some stuff. People denied their participation, took on other names, and so forth. So there's a lot of research on that. Now, Austria has a totally different story. In the so-called Moscow Declaration, 1943, signed by the British, by Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, it was declared that Austria was the first victim of Nazism. So in that way, they occupied this victim status. There's a second paragraph which then says, but they have to take responsibility for what they did in war crimes, etc. But that second paragraph is very rarely cited. So what every school child learned was this signing of the Moscow Declaration: Austria is a victim, not guilty. Austria didn't exist. It was annexed. Occupied. So as Austria didn't exist, Austria couldn't have done anything. And this victim status became the big myth. So 1945, finally, Austria was liberated by the Allied forces. And there are really interesting speeches which we have analyzed in various papers, like an innocent baby it started to grow again, and everything what had happened before was a nightmare, and no Austrian was responsible. Now, that changed totally with the Waldheim Affair, and in that way, the Waldheim Affair was really cathartic. Really a very big social intervention which really shook and shocked the entire society. I remember at that time I was a professor already, and students came to me and showed me the Wehrstammkarte of their fathers and said, "But you know, my father wasn't guilty." It went through every family. And there were huge debates, demonstrations, big demonstrations against fascism, against anti-Semitism. On the other side, there were also the far right, which was virulent already at that time. So it was really a process which then led to school books being newly written, a lot of research being done finally, and in 1990, finally an apology from the then Prime Minister from the Social Democratic Party, who said, well, Austria maybe has this victim status, but Austrians were also responsible, and he apologized basically in Parliament to Austria and the world, and he also did the same thing in Israel and in the Knesset. And in that way, this turned around the entire perception. So maybe Austria's state didn't exist, but the Austrians as people were responsible. And there was a second big intervention, if I might just mention that, in the 1990s, the so-called Wehrmacht exhibition, which was launched by a big entrepreneur from Hamburg, but also historian. And for the first time, the terrible war crimes of Wehrmacht soldiers were documented in an exhibition, because up to that date, nobody could deny the Holocaust. Nobody could deny deportations and all the terrible events which had taken place, but they were ascribed to the SS, Hitler and the SS. So these were the bad guys, and the other guys were forced to fight. We have already talked about this, the duty, yes. Following the orders. But suddenly, the war crimes of soldiers were shown, which they didn't have to do. Lynching people, civilians, especially on the Eastern Front, the mass murder of Jews, murdering Jews, Babi Yar, 10,000s of Jews shot. So suddenly it was clear the common soldier had taken part. The common soldier had made it possible that the trains ran. The common soldier had collected the people and put them in the trains. So suddenly this was obvious, and this exhibition with huge posters. I remember I was shocked in this exhibition. Posters 2 meters by 2 meters were hanging in big halls with horrible pictures. People could not deny anymore. And that was, again, a process which went through the entire society and which shook up, again, a myth. The Wehrmacht was innocent, the SS was guilty. Well, that didn't work anymore.
Obviously, Waldheim was still president when all of this was going on, or when most of it was going on.
But
he must have seemed... He was
only president for for 6 years. Yeah.
Sure. But this kind of collective exercising or exorcism of the past must have rendered him a very peculiar figure. It's worth pointing out that he was basically an international pariah. The Americans and understandably the Israelis basically refused to meet him. Did he almost become a complete spent force, a complete lame duck as president straight away?
Yes, because it wasn't just the Americans who actually then also put him on the watch list, which was a very controversial move. But basically, he wasn't invited anywhere. I think he did one state visit. I can't even remember where. There were many jokes about that, as you can imagine. He was really a total pariah, and it wasn't, as I said, just the Israelis, Americans, the Dutch, all Scandinavians, everywhere. He wasn't welcome. So Vranitzky, who was chancellor at that time, actually had to take up this role and travel and do state visits or welcome foreign leaders, etc., in Austria, because they didn't want to meet Waldheim, which is also the reason why he didn't stand for a second election. In Austria, you can stand for 2 elections. So after this election, he stood back and resigned. As I said, he had this very, well, as you also said, lame apology of having fulfilled his duty, and basically then kept to himself afterwards.
If we bring this up to date, we're now almost as far away from the Waldheim Affair as the Waldheim Affair was from the Second World War. This is quite a long time ago now, so it's a couple of generations of Austrians have grown up with this sort of new way of thinking about Austria's role. How well do you think that new way of thinking has been adopted? How completely do you think it's been adopted? Do you think this is essentially something that's permeated society? Because often with these kind of, social revolutions almost, they're basically adopted by the kind of intellectual classes, by a kind of small strata of society, but the rest of society just sort of carries on. How do you think Austria has done in terms of this? I keep coming back to the word, this kind of exorcism of its moral character.
Well, I think it's quite ambivalent. Yeah? There are some indicators which show that a lot has been taken on board, and not only from the elites and not intellectuals and not only from the left and anti-fascists. So in the sense that there are school books, that there are lectures in schools from survivors, which lots of events which are very, very important when kids meet survivors and hear life stories. And there's a lot of programs on television, radio, also on many, not just state television. So very many films, important films, famous actors, etc. So there's a lot going on, and also bottom up, sort of in districts, in areas where there are plaques put up for people who were murdered or deported. We have these so-called stumbling stones on the street where, it shows from this house so-and-so was deported, I don't know, to Treblinka or somewhere, and where now one knows when they died, and the family or the city of Vienna establishes these stumbling stones, and when you walk there, you see that something has happened. So there's a lot going on in popular culture, bottom up, but also top down, school, etc. On the other hand, Austria has a very large far-right party, and 86 is not only the date of Waldheim, it's also the date of Jörg Haider. The coup of Jörg Haider, the really quite charismatic leader of the far-right party, Austrian Freedom Party, did a coup in the fall of 1986, same year, and took over the Austrian Freedom Party, which up to that date had been very small, 6%, 7%, existing of former Nazis, and also liberals, but well-known former Nazis. But with Haider's sort of start, especially then after the fall of the Iron Curtain and when migrants started to come from the former Eastern countries, that party grew enormously, xenophobic and revisionist. And Haider was very famous for his revisionist utterances about the better unemployment policies which Hitler had and giving speeches where former SS people were present, and so forth and so on. And Haider got, in the year 1999, the general election, he got 27%. Now, that is a third, almost, of the population. So the Austrian Freedom Party, if you look at the European parties, is one of the oldest, older than the Front National in France, as it had been formerly called, and very strong. In the West, as strong as the Swiss, as the Norwegian, and the French. And that, although Austria is a very rich country and no big sort of social problems like in the South or in other countries. So as this far right still endorses sometimes quite openly fascist language. They invited Holocaust deniers like David Irving, who actually spent some time in prison in Austria because Holocaust denial is, you go to court.
Illegal. Yeah.
Illegal, you can get up to 10 years. So Austria remains polarized in that way, and the far-right party was together in the government twice with the Conservatives in the year 2000 until 2006, with Chancellor Schüssel, Conservative, and now with Kurz until the infamous Ibiza affair. So in that way, we have this polarization. We have, on the one hand, clear reflection, research, bottom-up, top-down, changes of this perception of victim status and the collective responsibility. On the other side, an acceptance, even as coalition partner, of the far right and of some very outspoken extreme right people.
Ruth, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed that. That's been a very interesting, enlightening conversation, I think, about something which is actually not very well known about. I've done a sort of informal poll of people, of friends of mine, and most of them have not heard of Kurt Waldheim, and they will have now. So I think it's a valuable story because it tells you a lot about how countries come to terms with traumatic events in their past. If people want to find out more about this, about what you've written about this, and I know that you're quite a prolific writer, not only about Waldheim but about right-wing populism more generally, what can they reach for?
Well, I have written, or we have published a book on the Waldheim Affair, but it's in German, and it has the title, I translate the title, "We Are Innocent Perpetrators," which is about the ambivalence of this Austrian mindset. But I have published a lot of papers also in English about the Waldheim Affair and the anti-Semitism. And in my book, The Politics of Fear, the shameless normalization of far-right populist discourse, which appeared last year, you find a lot also about Austria's past and the strange way of denial and justification, this very specific rhetoric which one can encounter and which can certainly be encountered elsewhere as well, because many countries have such skeletons in their cupboard. I might just want to point to a recent film where people can also get a kind of overview about the symbolic part of the Waldheim Affair. The producer, Ruth Wodak, produced the film Waldheim's Waltzer, and there you get a quite good overview, because it's really a documentary about what happened then without the broader discussion.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.